Hey, folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. Joining us today is Phil Watson, a veteran of the British Armed Forces and now a PhD candidate at the University of Wolverhampton, where his supervisor is none other than Dr. Spencer Jones. I mean, how cool is that? Dr. Jones was a guest on the podcast some time ago. Phil joins us today to discuss British doctrine in the Great War, which he wrote about in 3 articles for the Western Front Association's Stand 2 journal. We will be referencing the 3 articles in our discussion today. Phil, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for the invite. I'm really privileged. Thank you.
So we'll start off. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and your background, and how did you become interested in the First World War and this particular question of British doctrinal development?
Okay, let's try and jump to that in about 4 bits. Joined the army as a boy soldier. I was only 16. Joined in 1977. Finally got to my regiment in 1978. My regiment was a cavalry regiment, and its role was divisional reconnaissance, and that's what I've done all my life, or did all of my military career. Interestingly, before we move on, is that within the reconnaissance world, whether it's now or whether it was 300 years ago, decentralized command and mission command, where junior NCOs are given an awful lot of space to think and make decisions, was a culture I grew up in. So I have known nothing different. So that will be a segue later on as we go through this. Spent at least 50% of my time in Germany, backwards and forwards during the Cold War. I served half my time in the ranks, up to the rank of warrant officer, and then I was commissioned from the ranks into as an officer, from sergeant major to the rank of captain, and I held the rank of captain, then major, right the way through to the end of my career, which was in 2012. Finishing as a major and commanding our headquarters squadron, something that the cavalry allows you to do in the British Army, where late entry officers or rankers get to command, which is wonderful. And then during that period of time, like all soldiers in the UK, fair share of operational tours, 2 United Nations tours, one in Cyprus, one in Bosnia, a NATO tour back to Bosnia, the obligatory tour in Northern Ireland, in Belfast.
Okay.
And then and Desert Storm, Gulf War One, did that as a reconnaissance troop sergeant as well. So yeah, a good smattering of tours, which is no more or no less really than everybody else. Came out of the army in 2012, got into my 35 years. And then I came in. We have the ability to continue to work for your regiment as a civil servant. There's 2 jobs which you can apply for. I was fortunate I got that. And primarily the role is in 2 halves. One is support to our regimental museums, which is history. And the other one is support to regimental veterans. We're a charitable trust, and soldiers donate money, etc. And we have investments by which we can provide financial assistance in addition to that is their statutory requirement here in the UK. So in total, 48 years service to my regiment. Came out of the regiment at the end of, just prior to the COVID period. Went to Wolverhampton to do my master's, again under Spencer, but he was my second supervisor, with Gary Sheffield being my main supervisor. And then just, I want to say, rolled over into the PhD, had to wait a year to do my PhD. And now I'm literally, in my final year, just about to submit. To go back to the middle question, which was the history, we were amalgamated as a regiment in the 1960s. And when the 2 regiments came together, the elders of the regiment came together, they decided that they were going to have a particular day they could share. And they looked back in history and said, when was the last time our two regiments used their lances in battle against another mounted opponent or against another opponent? And that was during the retreat from Mons in 1914. And it's called Mons Moy. So the first one obviously reflects the retreat from Mons. And we have two charges. One at the beginning of Doctrine on the 24th, where Captain Grenfell gets his Victoria Cross. And then we have on the last day of the retreat from Mons, the last Lance versus Lance charge of the British Army at a place called Le Moncel. So that was the 9th Lancers. And then the 12th had a very successful action on the 28th of August, a place called Moy or Muy de Lane. And that's when they were doing the rear guard for Gough as Haig is withdrawing. Mm-hmm. And it is a classic cavalry action, which is epitomised by the saying that it was peacetime training put into practice, and it was how to get things right first time. Where maybe if we look at Aldreney, the first charge wasn't as successful as they might have thought. So I started my regimental history about 1995. I was asked to do a presentation on the regimental day. Realised I knew nothing about it. All I did, I just quoted stuff that everybody else was quoted, opened a few books to find out it was nothing like what we thought it was, but the real story was much better. The folklore was fine, but the myth, it was what it was, but the real story was amazing. So slowly but surely, I was a regimental historian really for a significant period of time, not paid, just as by opportunity. And then when I came out, I was working at Home Headquarters. I just thought, well, I needed something to bring it all together. I was stuck in 14, knew a bit about 15 Eeps, knew a bit about Somme. So what I've done, and what I'm doing at the moment is I am very slowly inching my way forward to the end of the war. Doing an awful lot on Haig in 1916. Oddly, I've come slightly backwards because looking at the period of 1918, specifically around the point that things change. Here in the UK, we have a very Anglo-centric view. We call it the last 100 days. Mm-hmm. If you bring it back very slightly and start there and clock from the point at which Foch becomes the generalissimo, and then he is then commanding both the Americans, the French, the Belgians, and ourselves, to me, that seems to be a more holistic approach to it. So at the moment, I've got half of 16 and all of 17 to look at, and that's where we're at. I think the advantage of being a regimental historian is that if your regiment has an unbroken service from 1715, you have a thread of continuity.
Yes.
And I know you're an ex-military guy as well, but if you work on the assumption that you have an unbroken line, that if each generation is handing on its knowledge to each subsequent generation, you go on your courses, you get taught stuff. But actually, when you're on exercise and you're doing whatever you're doing in your tank, and I'm doing the same, actually, I'm just doing as my troop sergeant told me to do so. Later on, you learn why, but most of what you do is you learn on the job. Now, if you have an unbroken line of 300 years, that is a fantastic legacy, and you can look back and go, where did this start? And going back to the point of origin, I think, is something as a historian we ought to try and do just a little bit more often. So hopefully that brings you questions there. Mike, a little bit about me, a little about history. Doctrine, just going to that, I'm blessed. My regiment every year had a study period called Exercise Steel Sabre, and we would stop for a week and we would go into the classroom. All of the crew commanders, the crew commander is defined as anybody who commands a vehicle, so all the young officers, all the sergeants, and all the corporals. Well, in a recce regiment, we have 4 cars, 1 officer, 1 sergeant, 2 corporals. So 50% of our car commanders are corporals. So as corporals, we sat there and learnt doctrine along as everybody else. And like everything, you do it from young enough and then long enough, a bit sticks. And then the British decided it was going to formalise its doctrine. And we had quite a big push. Lots of presentations telling us about mission command. I was a corporal at the time, and we were all sort of sat at the back row like naughty schoolboys. And we just looked at each other and went, yeah, well, we already do that anyway. And then somebody had found mission command and they'd gone back to Auftrag tactic. Well, if you're a reconnaissance car commander, that's your bread and butter anyway. All of a sudden, one day somebody gave it a name as far as we were concerned, and nothing more.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. So interesting. So fellow cavalrymen here, I was actually in a cavalry unit as well. It's kind of like a hunter killer concept. So we had the Bradleys with the
Yeah,
tank.
yeah.
So one cav, and our unit actually goes back, is one of the oldest units in the U.S. Army as well. It was one cav, and this is embarrassing, but I've forgotten it. It's a lot of ones. It's First Squadron, First United States Cavalry, First Regiment of Dragoons, First Armor Division. Back in the day, I believe it's a different unit now, but yeah, amazing to have, like you said, to have that continuity. We had, yeah, and hearing you speak about like how much you think you really know. Like, yes, I also have the folklore of my unit, but as far as like real deep down into the weeds of actually knowing things, yeah, there's a lot of gaps there. Oh, that's.
I think there's an interesting concept as historians, which is we talk about reform, Cardwell reforms, Haldane reforms. We talk about reforms. And reform seems to be this thing that the government imposes when things haven't gone as well as they should have done. And then we write reports, Elgin, Esher, Bartholomew. But what I think is overlooked because it's not visible, which is we evolve anyway. Every operational tour I've ever done, I'll tell you one thing: we were better when we came back. And then what you do, you look at each other, and I remember going on our third consecutive tour in the same squadron with the same guys. We looked at each other and went, "We're all right, aren't we?" And went, "Yeah, we're sorted." Because even the bad ones, we knew how bad they were. So you just don't give them stuff to do. So that's how it is. Yes, no one's going to make the bad ones go away. You just stand him on a gate with a stick. So the absolute reality is I think for me, we were talking before we came on air, which is, how do you prove that continual evolution is not taking place? It's called military Darwinism, the quick and the dead, blah, 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 whatever you want to call it. Is we've always done that. And then we get a report, and then we get a reform, but we never consider that actually we're very self-critical. And if we're not very good, note to self, could do better next time, and we'll go away and we'll become better. So I think the invisible evolution is difficult for historians to track, but we know it exists, but neither of us can prove it particularly well.
Yes. So, going to move into the topic here of doctrine, and I have here. The question is, I've got a quote here actually. So I was referencing an American primer on U.S. Army doctrine, and really interesting quote here from none other than JFC Fuller, which I'm going to read here in full now. So, speaking of doctrine, the central idea of an army is known as its doctrine, which, to be sound, must be based on the principles of war, and which, to be effective, must be elastic enough to admit of mutation in accordance with change in circumstances. In its ultimate relationship to the human understanding, this central idea or doctrine is nothing else than common sense, that is, action adapted to circumstances. JFC Fuller, The Foundations of the Science of War. So that actually, harps on a lot of stuff that we were just talking about.
And when we go down, I hate the word semantic because I love words, but it's called the Sans Doctrine debate, which is there's a chunk of history, or scholastic history, where there's a period of time where it was decided that the British Army went to war with no doctrine at all. Well, that's fine, we can come to that. But actually, it's almost based on the presence and absence of the word alone. I know people can't see this, but there's good old-fashioned field service regulations, the Red Book.
Okay.
And in the opening cover, it says, simple word is, it is by authority. Okay, by authority. At the end of the war, field service regulations get modified a few times, and there's lots of paper amendments and stuff, and then we have the SS publications. But then between the wars, we have a provisional copy with a blue paper folder, 1920. And in here, for the first time, the principles of war get listed, and now we're going to discuss that later on. So this is the madness of our history. If you're a World War II historian and you want to know what the British Army had learnt after the war, you pick this one up because it's the first one after the war. And it says doctrine, so they take it as doctrine. And then they'll argue about, was it right, was it wrong, and did they read it? The First World War historian, when he looks at the very first one from 1902, a very thin book, the command philosophy is the same in 1902, 1903, 1905, 1909, and 1914. But none of them say doctrine. So the absence of the word for many people has made them turn away. Hopefully, I'm not come on here to be sort of controversial, but if you say that that isn't the doctrine and you put it off to one side, then it creates a vacuum, a space where you can talk about what should have happened. And academics love that. Okay, you create a vacuum, you deny something, and then you can pontificate forever about how and what it should be. But just suppose for a crazy minute, it is the doctrine and it's all in there, but you don't read it. It just means that all the answers to all the questions that everybody almost ever wanted to know, they're there, but you've got to read it. Now, back to what I call our military backgrounds, you're going to pick that up, you're going to read it and go, it's doctrine. Because you're reading it and you go, this is doctrine. So we see it as such. And I think for anybody with any military background, it is much easier for us to see. It's a very famous quip, which if it looks like a duck and it quacks, it's probably a duck.
Mm-hmm.
What I'd argue is, though, you need to know what a duck looks like. And we're pretty good at looking at ducks. So the first thing is that the semantic debate of whether it is or whether it isn't based on a word, it probably is the worst of all arguments. And then there's this thing about the doctrine, which is, okay, so you take, I could go into the book, you've got something very famous book by Bidwell and Graham, Firepower. It's probably they don't mean to set the cattle stampeding, but they quote a man called General Langlois. He was a Frenchman who wrote in the British papers post-Boer War, and he writes twice. And he writes one quite critically and says, and he uses a thing called the Sands Doctrine debate. And everybody, a chunk of historians have used that. But Langlois writes later when he comes back after the chief of staff post being created and everything else has happened that's supposed to happen. And he turns around and says that very soon the British Army will be the best army in the world. But nobody quotes Langlois's second statement. Right. They do the first. But again, Bidwell and Graham, brilliant book. But when they talk about there is no doctrine, they're talking about, and this is where we need to help our non-military friends. They're talking about tactical artillery doctrine, not strategic doctrine, not cavalry doctrine, not infantry doctrine. So I made this up as a joke, really. So if you take strategic doctrine, operational doctrines, strategic, government, operational and tactical, there's probably 4 or 5 different levels of doctrine that you can come up with. And then let's just for the First World War go, well, there's only 3 at the beginning, is it? There's only cavalry, infantry and artillery. Flying Corps and aviation's in its infancy and there are no tanks, so you've only got 3. That actually, if you then take the command philosophy, which is how you apply the doctrine, which is either centralized or decentralized, if you're going to roll the dice and say there is no doctrine, it's about a 13-sided dice. So what do you mean? Do you mean that actually there was no tactical Flying Corps doctrine? Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was none because we hadn't got it. So when you talk about, and in Firepower, about La Chateau and the guns pulling up alongside the infantry like at Waterloo, it makes absolute sense. But to turn around and say the British Army had no doctrine as a single entity, not only cannot be correct, but it is not correct. And what we've done is it's set people off. Now, a load of academic papers started to be written probably in the last decade, where it started to creep back in where when people who are not particularly writing about the field service regulations specifically, they just say could be found, the doctrine could be found in the FSR. So the word doctrine and the FSR is used in the same sentence. So we've kind of moved on. So what we're trying to do, and certainly with my PhD, is again, the benefit of being the type of guys we are, saying, well, I'll tell you what, in the last decade, we've decided that the field service regulations are the doctrine. So let's be bold now and let's go. They weren't the doctrine; they contained the doctrine, and let's have a look at what the doctrine was. So then, what we can talk about, was it right and was it wrong, rather than did it exist, and base the argument actually on the presence or the absence of a word. that is academic history probably at its worst for me, of which, of course, I will be criticised for saying something such as that. Do military men have a complete monopoly on understanding? We just probably something that falls a little bit easier to. You pick it up and go. On my master's course, there was 5 people ex-military and 1 serving. He's a 1-star at the moment.
Oh,
and
really?
we all looked at each other and we're having a coffee, go, but it is Doctrine, isn't it? We went, yeah, of course it is. So, but of course, then you watch your P's and Q's, and then you write your papers academically to answer the questions to satisfy the academic argument. So I think that definition from Henderson, given it, and it's called teleological. And this is my big bone of contention with where we are at the moment historically, which is stop saying it wasn't doctrine and applying your understanding of doctrine as you understand it from today. Read Henderson's. Henderson's is absolutely, couldn't be better, could not be a better thing. But what it is, so if you're looking at doctrine within the concept of almost like a biblical text, where it's a non-negotiable, well, that doesn't imply flexibility, does it? So what you have is you have a flexible doctrine, which I think we would call an oxymoron. It's like a plastic glass. How can you have? Well, if you read, and I've written quite a whole chapter on this, is we use 2 words called doctrine and dogma. And dogma is when you take your doctrine, whether it be attaque outrance like the French, okay, or envelopment like the Germans, and you use it for every single occasion. And my analogy would be, I think it's a safe one, given our audience, which is if you take a bag of golf clubs, and all you do every time is just take the big one out and use it for every shot. Oh, by the way, I don't play golf. Whether you're teeing off or you're chipping or you're in a bunker, but all you do is the same time is you just get the biggest club in the bag and you just whack it. That is dogma. Having a bag of tricks and selecting the right one as per the circumstance, like Henderson says, that is the application of doctrine. And that's where both the British are and the Americans. And interestingly, post-war, the Kirk Report, no one ever reads it. You buy it off eBay, it's only £10. At no point does 2 things. And I challenge people respectfully. Nobody at the end of the war in 1918 goes, you know what, we were wrong. We should have adopted that French and German stuff. Nobody in the Kirk Report goes, oh my God, when we went to war, we had no doctrine. That conversation on the docks at Southampton between Haig, Grierson, Allenby, et al., not one looked to the other and go, oh my God, what are we going to do? We've got no doctrine. That conversation does not take place. So right. If you take those 2 bookends of 1932 and the docks at Southampton, that I think the balance of proof now, when it comes to the absence of doctrine, it's about balance of proof and proving for those that still continue to believe that is the case to say, well, what exactly do you mean and can you prove it? Because, of course, we now have evidence strongly to the contrary that it's not the case.
Bill, before we get into Colonel George Henderson, something I've thought of in this talk of like, the British Army had no doctrine.
I can see it in your eyes. I can see it. It's brilliant. I can see it. But that's what it's about, isn't it? But that's what it's about. The answer is now we're going to talk about doctrine. We're now not going to talk about its absence. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, pardon my ignorance here, but is this, the British Army had no doctrine? Is this some kind of offshoot of the whole lions leading donkeys talk?
The answer is yes. I've got another presentation which on World War I TV, which we did with Paul Woodidge, and he said exactly the same. He says it supports the narrative, doesn't it, of the British underdog, right? Being unprepared, and the greatest thing about being British is you can lose every battle as long as you don't lose the last one. It's a craziness. That the answer is. But the scary thing is if you then say, well, we did go to war with doctrine, and that sometimes it was less successful than others. But when you bear in mind, and we can say it now, that this was designed for a British expeditionary force of 100,000 men of 3 corps, not an army of 5 armies. Right. In a protracted European war to be used by Canadians, Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, and a conscript and a new army. This you had to use with underpinning knowledge. Well, when in 1914, getting on the boat, it was just fine. But of course, all of a sudden, they needed something more. That to apply those principles of war, you had to have an underpinning knowledge and had previous operational experience. Then that's fine. Bearing in mind that that's how big it is. It goes in your pocket.
Right. Right.
Up to 1859, they were this big. So in 1859, we started putting them in our pockets. The reality is at this point, it becomes, and you've just used the word, my favorite word, it's a primer. That's it. You open it and go, okay, memory jog, put it in my pocket, get on with the job. I just needed to remember what I needed to do, but it will not teach me. It will not teach me the underpinning knowledge behind it. Well, of course, if you're a conscript or a volunteer and you've come straight from the factories, even if you're blue collar or come from management, you're unlikely to have those skills.
It's interesting the size of the British FSR, because the American FSR dated 1914. I have it on the shelf here somewhere.
Yeah.
Similar size, probably similar idea.
Put it in your pocket, and later you get a thing called field service pocketbook, which every soldier carried. And that's even better because it's got a wax cover, and these are brilliant. But of course, these reference the FSR. So I always talk about this, and we won't have time today. But if everybody can see the books behind, field service regulations is a compendium of works. The one that nobody can ever find, what's downstairs, is the staff manual war, and that is the one that sits above the FSR in the middle, and then all your specialty arms, infantry, cavalry, aviation, engineers, all these other books, they sit underneath. But when you read them, they both reference up and down by page, reference, and paragraph number. So they're not written in isolation at all. In fact, exactly the opposite. That even if you look at manoeuvre training 1911, it's referencing all the artillery. It's got the field army training, etc. You have to read them as a compendium and works. But of course, if you're an artilleryman, you don't. You're just reading the field service regulations, then fat part 1, fat part 2. So yeah, that's where we are.
All right. So referencing the first of your 3 articles, Henderson and the Principles of War of the BEF. So just for folks who don't know, who was Colonel George Henderson, and how did his Principles of War evolve through his tenure at the Royal Military College in Sandhurst and the Staff College in Camberley?
Okay. George Henderson died early. He was only 48. Towards the end of his life, I'll say a man of poor health. If we reverse his life, he's known more than anything, known for being the intelligence officer during the Boer War under Kitchener and Roberts. Towards the end of the war, he becomes of poor health, and he's sent back to the UK initially to write the history of the Boer War. Starts that, doesn't complete it, but is given a job to rewrite infantry training, and it was going to be infantry training 1902. But he actually started writing an overarching publication, and they realised that in what became combined training 1902, that much of what he had written applied to everybody. So they separated. Simplistic here, I know it's much more complicated than this, but basically separated the 2 publications out in 1902, called Combined Training Provisional 1902, Infantry Training 1902, and they're both in the provisional form. But they were both commissioned by Roberts, who was obviously the commander-in-chief during the Boer War, and they predate Elgin and the Escher committees. That's important because this is what I'm talking about, the army doing self-evolution, not waiting for reforms. And then we get the Elgin report, the Eschers and the Norfolk reports, and they do all of that stuff. Roberts had started this already with Henderson right at the end of the war. So let's look at Henderson himself. It started a very short period of time teaching at Sandhurst. Clearly, talents was recognised, and then he moved on to the Staff College at Camberley. I've got a colleague, a friend of mine, who works at the Staff College, and they've got a database. So I asked him for a data trawl. So if you take from the minute that Henderson is teaching, Henderson obviously then leaves to go to the Boer War. Spoiler alert, Henderson dies in 1903. That at the end of that period of time, that he writes a series of Principles of War. and it's in Woolley Robertson's file in the Little Heart. I was there the other week. I went to have a look at it again to get another photograph, and it's in its 6th edition in 1912. Okay, so this is Watson's Maths. So if we assume, and if you go now into the Henderson file, it's got all of his lectures from when he was the commandant at the Staff College, because that's the significance of 1912. Woolley Robertson's the commandant at the Staff College. If you go through his file, it's got all of his lectures, mostly of them geopolitical. They're exactly the type of lectures you'd expect the commandant to be making. He's not in the weeds. Henderson makes a couple of bold speeches each year, which you can find in the Army Review, which he talks about the field service regulations. And that's just neat because it ties it all in. But actually, one of the lectures, he actually lectures from Henderson's Science of War, which is amazing. Henderson's Science of War, just to explain for the listeners, it's a compendium of his essays. Got to be careful, because when Neil Malcolm put them together as the editor, they are not chronological. So if you read it at the beginning, it's a bit like reading Clausewitz on war. Note, they're not chronological. If you want to understand how Clausewitz's thought develops and how Henderson's thoughts develops, you've got to read them chronologically. And some people, when they've not noticed it, they've said, oh, look, it's a contradiction. My thoughts on Haig right now will change next year. As I grow and think and develop, my understanding will become far more nuanced. Mm-hmm. So, working on the assumption, again, another assumption that what Henderson wrote in his essays, he also taught. I think we can presume that quite safely, that from the minute he started teaching to the last candidates from the Staff College leaving in 1912, just short of 1,000 officers passed through Staff College. Okay. If you then look at Peter Hodgkinson's book on infantry battalion commanders, he estimates that 70% of the 157, so that's 110, commanding officers had been to Staff College. There's another work, I think it might be by Albert Palazzo, I'm not sure, but he is a little bit more critical and said that during the war, actually, of the 1,000 staff officers that were trained at any one time, there was only 400 or 500 in post. So just take those figures. Henderson was responsible for teaching 1,000 officers. Mm-hmm. You can read his works in his book. It was so good that the commandant was still using it in 1912, right. And 70% of the 157 battalion commanders, who later would be brigade commanders and divisional commanders and corps commanders, were taught by Henderson. That is the level of his influence. He's, and as Woolley Robertson says, nobody in the defeat of the Germans should be given more credit than Henderson for his influence on the British Army. So it's pretty huge. As you mentioned, but what Henderson, like most scholars, and I mean like most scholars, you go back and look at any of them that are writing in the British service journals, they're purists of the greatest book. They are massive purists. They want everybody to go to bed and sleep with a copy of On War under their bed and read it as they go to bed, and this consumes every minute of every day of their lives. It doesn't. But what they don't want to do, and in there are quite a lot of debates during the staff officers conferences, which is the January of every year, about trying to produce a book of standard tactics for the British Army, and whether it's Smith-Dorrien and Woolley Robertson and everybody whose names you would know, they're going, no, we don't want to do that, because we need these people to think for themselves. The very people who we want to think themselves will just go, well, it says here in the book, so this is the way that we're going to do it, which, of course, is what the SS publications 143 and 135 do later on. But they are now debating this for a British Expeditionary Force of professional soldiers. And he says, on at least 4 different occasions, I don't like doing this, but I will. Here's a few principles. They may help you out. And if you take the sum total of his principles, all the principles he writes about over all the time, you can find in the field service regulations, and you can find in Moose that the American Army use today. They are no different. I think the point is you, and this is where you would not cross the line, because this is where you need space for academics to to contemplate. And that is, if you, and I've just done this for a British military digital magazine, is I can take one of the principles of war, which is concentration of mass at the decisive point. I can produce a unbroken line from today to Sun Tzu. Yeah. Okay. So if we then turn around and go, wow, this is the dichotomy, isn't it? Are they immutable? Have they never changed? Have they always been the same? Does each generation, are they learning from each other, or are they just discovering the same principles because they are never changing? I offer no solution. I'll leave that space for the academics to muse. But the absolute reality is of the 8 that you find, the fuller rights for the first time, they're all in the text of the Field Service Regulations 1909, and they're all in the essays of Science of War. So for the purpose of our course, which is just looking at a legacy of Henderson from the pre-Boer War all the way through the interwar years to 1914 and beyond, the continuity is. They say, but what do you now do? What do you guys do? What do the Americans do? What you've got to do is you've got to then look at Henderson's work on Stonewall Jackson. Mm-hmm. There's a suggestion by my friend that the American understanding, Americans are really good because they do all the translations of Jemini's work well before the Brits do at West Point. And we use your books because we didn't translate them. Why? And this is something just to throw out there and just leave it hanging. Most British officers during that period of time owned French was good enough to read them in the original language. And that's why they can't read Clausewitz in German. And most British officers who read Clausewitz in the early days read Clausewitz translated into French, not in its original German.
Okay.
So if you have a look, I'm not sure, did I print stuff? That if you want to, and the worst thing about Henderson is he doesn't footnote anything, but if you read the text of everybody that he mentions, that all of the ancients, whether it be Alexander or Caesar, then you come through Marlborough, through to Wellington, through to Napoleon, through to Archduke Charles, all the way through to Jemini and Clausewitz. They are mentioned. So the introduction to maybe a military structure that doesn't have the same longevity as the British thing, if you read Stonewall Jackson's work by Henderson alone, would have almost ground dumped a whole load of stuff. But what's interesting is a fantastic webpage written by Hugh Davies, and it's what set me off on my little journey, which was it was called "So Who Did Officers Read Before Clausewitz?" I don't know. You can't go to a military lecture in the world where somebody doesn't clang Clausewitz's name into it somewhere. Normally, to lean on their own ideas, isn't it? Go to Clausewitz, go to somebody notable, a Tim Travers or a Hugh Strawn, pick somebody notable and prop your argument against theirs because of their reputation. Mm-hmm. And that's what people will do with Napoleon, and that's what people will do with Wellington, and that's what people will do. But if you look, it's a brilliant piece of work done by somebody else, if I printed it off, and it was looking at George Patton, and it was looking at George Patton's library. People need to look at it later on. It's a guy, a man called Dietrich, and it's all about Patton's library. And Patton himself, on his book, he's got a book by a man called General Henry Lloyd. General Henry Lloyd was writing in the 1700s, and he is the very first person during the Enlightenment period who writes about the principles of war. Huh. So what you're able to do, and I think he's a guy from your side, a guy called, it'll come to me in a minute, doesn't matter. And he produces the library of Wellington and Napoleon. So if I can see your library from here, and I noticed you don't have a complete collection of the history of the First World War yet, but you're getting there. But our bookcases are fascinating, aren't they? So therefore, if you know what people are reading, you can't prove that they digested it or implemented it. But if we know that George Patton was reading General Henry Lloyd, who is the very first writer of concentration of mass at the decisive point, and General Henry Lloyd is cited by Jomini and Clausewitz. So it's what I call follow the breadcrumbs back until you can't go back any further. And that's trying to look for the origin. That if you say that all of these people, and this is where personality-based history comes from, which is if you say there is no doctrine, then success or failure is entirely built around the personality of the human being. And then we bring in the word genius, that he'd never read a book in his life, but it was amazing. But the answer is, even both Kitchener and Wellington, they went to and did their military learning. They went over to France to learn because there was nothing in Britain. So I think looking at the threads of knowledge and where people go back to is the commonality of thread. I'll say it doesn't matter who you read. You're probably not going to read a lot different, regardless of which book that you pick up, because broadly they are the same. And we can go through a few of those if you want, Mike.
Actually, I wanted to just so listeners could know some of these. We don't. Yeah. I know there's several of them, but if we could just name a few of Colonel Henderson's principles of war. You mentioned one.
What we'll do is we'll take the ones from here.
Yes.
Which are the ones so all of these that Fuller writes, of the 8 that the British Army uses today and the Americans use today, are in there 1909, but you've got to read it to find them. In other words, they're not in neat bullet points. So, easiest way to remember, I created a character called Company Sergeant Major Smoke, CMS Smoke, although smoke is spelt with a C. So, cooperation. No one's going to disagree with that. Unity of effort, working together. Security, okay? Got to be safe. Don't want the bad guys to creep up on you.
Right.
Maintenance of the objective. Know what and why you're fighting for and stick to the plan. Surprise. At the end of the day, the biggest one of them all and the most difficult in World War I is you need to act before, and hopefully catch the guys unawares. It's so you retain initiative. The Germans attacking at Verdun stole the initiative. They surprised the French and the British. Okay, that's surprise at the ultimate level. Offensive action, nobody in 1914 through to 18, in fact, not until Little Hart and Fuller after the war went to talk about the indirect approach, nobody's not talking about attacking people and killing them. No one's talking about putting a blockade in and starving the Germans out. No one is not talking about any other way. The only example you'll find of indirect use of the field service regulations is T.E. Lawrence in Arabia. I can come back and talk about him. He is just, when it comes to the maneuverist, he is amazing. But he still uses the same principles, which is amazing. Concentration, which is concentration of mass or effect at the decisive point, which is probably the one, not the oldest, but it's the one that everyone has talked about. And then there's a balance. It's called the economy of force. And economy of force means if I need to be strong in one place and I've got to build a mass in a particular area, I'm going to take troops from elsewhere. Right. So I can't be strong everywhere. So now this is where the generalship comes into it. And genius, which is if I can't be strong everywhere, I'm going to have to take troops from somewhere and pretty well gamble that I'm not going to be attacked in those areas. Now, if I just talk about that as CSM smoke, you guys, Americans, you call them principle of operations. You've got mass, you've got objective, you've got offensive, you've got security, you've got economy of force, you've got a mover, you've got unity of command, surprise and simplicity. Well, there you go. We have arrived at this point by two separate. Now, this is the argument for your scholars out there. Have we arrived at the same point by two entirely different lines of approach, or have we spoken to each other? Are they immutable, that it doesn't matter how many times you roll the dice, it's always going to be the same 8, the same 10? And it's fascinating because, of course, we used to do this when we was a young soldier, and you'll have done the same when you have to do Padre's hour on a Sunday morning and go and talk to the Padre. And you would always say, well, there's your. We have two more principles of war, and one is sustainability, and the other one is maintenance of morale. So there's our 10. We'll take your simplicity, thank you very much, and we'll make you 11. So what you say to this is, can anybody come up with a 12th? Can you come up with the 11th commandment? That was the Padre's questions. There you go. That would keep you busy for an hour. But the point is, can you come up with? I mean, if people say, well, what about unity of effort, cooperation? Okay, they all fit into one of the existing ones already. Now the British we review every 5, we rewrite every 10, and we always expand on what they are. My understanding from a colleague is you guys pretty well just leave them as they are and let people interpret them in your own way, which is what we're doing anyway. It just means that you don't have to revise. So 8 principles of war, they're all in the original thing. Henderson's teaching them. Henderson doesn't like them, but Clausewitz doesn't either. When Clausewitz talks about principles, he calls anybody that he would refer to Fuller as he calls him well, he doesn't because he's not alive, but they are called scribblers of compendia. He hates them. He says it twice in On War. Stop writing bullet points. Make them read it. But of course, that's fine for the professionals, but it's not good for an irregular, a conscript, or a volunteer army. They need a few clues, don't they? So they are the principles of war. I won't say they don't change, but you can apply them at a strategic level or a tactical level. So Haig, as he's going from being a corps commander to an army commander to commander in chief, he just goes, and from being a student, and being a cavalryman, he uses them at every stage. He just applies them to whatever level is at. And that's the point that people kind of miss. And I know it's a question we come to the end, which is, they're there to be played with, to be teased with, to be speculated with, to be applied, because that's the language that he's speaking. That he'll talk about the application of protection as a cavalryman, because a cavalryman will provide the screen.
Right.
He'll talk about it as a BF. He'll then talk about it at a strategic level. So he will look at concentration or surprise at every single level, and he is able to do that, which we can touch on in a minute.
Yeah, actually, I mean, we've talked about my next questions that I had. Like Henderson didn't care for a list of tabulated principles, but you see the need for it though. Like post-war, where okay, we don't just have a professional army; we now have conscripts and irregulars who we need to teach them this stuff fast.
Yeah.
And reference this list. Yes, you need to go deeper afterwards. And we can see Henderson's legacy in clearly developing a doctrine for the British Army. If we can move onto Haig, actually, in your second article, Phil. So the second article is Haig Doctrine, Find, Fix, Strike, and Exploit. And I have to tell you, you just said a few minutes ago, what you think of Haig will change. And I came away changed in my opinion of Haig, because it's like now in the DNA that Haig, a bungler and a butcher, and I've read more and more and more that he was trying to do the best with what he had and the knowledge that he had at the time. But I have to say, your articles, just as you said just a moment ago, he is referencing those principles of war all the time in his written work, and it's, I came away much more of a thinker than wow. Okay,
that is from Bourne. Every principle and every mention of command philosophy. That's how many times, every minute of every day, in every word. That I produced this at a talk the other day, and somebody went, "That is a brilliant visual age." That is how it is. It's the language that he speaks.
Yeah.
I've probably spent. Oh, sorry, just to go. I know we've got to keep an eye on time. I had a guy who called me out a bit on social media, like they do, like you guys do that, and he said it's his opinion. I said, "Well, is that your opinion based on a lifetime of study of the primary sources, or is that an opinion from a man, of an author that you've remembered, and it just already, and it seems to chime with your beliefs that you already had? That's not historical research. That's karaoke.
Yes.
It's history karaoke. All you're doing is you're just singing the words of another person.
Mm-hmm.
I have stopped reading books on Haig. They're painful. They really are. I'm 65. My father lived to 85. I've got 20 good years left, and I don't propose to waste any more reading stuff that clearly people have already come to the party with a negative bias.
Okay.
That is called, my good friend Andy Locke he calls it the intellectualization of the donkeys debate. Take the donkeys debate, don't challenge it, and then come up with a load of reasons why it is that way scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
That's intellectualization of the donkey's narrative, which I thought was a lovely phrase, and I'm sticking with it.
I like that.
But hey, if you spend an awful lot of time reading his letters and his essays and his notebooks, you would have nothing but admiration for the man. You would understand not just his beliefs, the fact his relationship with his wife, that Haig, the man, is inside his words. And if anybody can come from a position of conspiracy, that from the minute he put the first pen to paper in 1896 at Staff College, he was situating his own history for the end of the war. Yeah, prove that one. That's just, right. I can't go there. Sorry, we don't have enough time. So you look at this thing, find, fix, strike, pursuit. For readers, there you go. Infantry drill 1896. That's where you find it. So the crazy thing is, it's before the Boer War. Mm-hmm. So, of course, most people see the Boer War, that we learned from the Boer War. What people don't realise is all the doctrine that we've written in the 1870s and 1880s, post-Crimea, we haven't put into practice. We've just watched the Prussians be really good at it. Mm-hmm. We change our doctrine, we do, through debate. We go from square and column and line to extended line and skirmishing. The first time we put that into practice is in the Boer War. And therefore that becomes our proving ground. Come back after the Boer War, some of it went well, some of it didn't, and we modified our tactical doctrine. Mm-hmm. The construct of fighting a battle since Napoleonic periods, which means the size of the army, which is an army of mass as opposed to something small, is. And Littleheart, I'll explain it simply, then Basil Littleheart has a really good analogy, which I think brings it home. You got to find your enemy, know where he is, and know what he's doing and what he consists of. Okay? Then you got to fix, you got to pin him to the ground.
Right.
So he can't move, and hopefully he can't reinforce. Okay? Then you got to strike, and you've got to hit him so hard, okay, that you destroy him physically and morally. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, that may fit, and that does fit into Rawlinson's bite and hold. You can get that in there, and it also fits into the wearing down battle, which obviously everybody talks about, the battle d'azur, which both Foch and Haig uses. And then the next one is called pursuit or exploit. Originally, that was done by the cavalry, and basically, you rout them, you run them off the battlefield, and you put them to the sword. Okay. And by doing that, then you have to kill them, otherwise they come back. Right. And we can think of all the conflicts that have happened in the last 20 years where the campaign has not been completed and the bad guys come back. So this is Basil Littleheart, and he talks about it. It's a man in a darkened room, like it's a black room. He doesn't know where, he can't see anything, and he's reaching out in front of him, looking for the bad guy, and that's his reconnaissance. And he's trying to find him, and as soon as he finds him, he grips him by the throat and holds him. Okay, and in the dark, from a direction he cannot see, he beats him with his other hand. And he beats him and he beats him and he beats him. Okay, and he doesn't stop until he's dead. Find, fix, strike, pursuit. That is the way that all battles have been constructed. Of course, for Haig, in the first part of the war, the finding part kind of is sort of done by French, really, in the BEF. That was the finding bit. And then the fixing, okay, and then the wearing down and the exploit. The exploit comes in the 100 days, okay? Mm-hmm. And that's, I know you're going to ask this question about, does he take something and retrospectively apply it? No, he is just applying the 4-phase battle to the war. That's all he's doing. He's not retrospectively engineering it because he can't think of any other way, but he does specifically say the reason he does it because he doesn't want people to learn unsound doctrines. There'd been nothing worse than the Brits and the Americans coming back from Desert Storm and completely changing what we did by the way of warfare off the back of one war. Right. Off the back of the First World War, off the back of the Boer War. Well, you've got to find, and it was in Tactica in the 80s, the Russian manual, which said about Afghanistan, many lessons were learned, but not all were relevant. You've got to work out what the relevant lessons are. And that's where it comes from. Find, fix, strike, pursuit. It's no different. It hasn't changed. We still use the same. It's called the tactical framework. first written in 1896 and is still used today. And I know it's quite dangerous to say if we still use it today and it was in 1896, it kind of proves its legitimacy, but it kind of does in a sort of a way. So you say, well, there are some parts where we forget in the whole of the war that once they do the breakthrough and the break in, that's when the maneuver and the pursuit then comes. Because what we have is we have this period of the fix and the wearing down. Okay, which lasts 16 and 17. It lasts years, but the principles are there. And I don't think, if I felt for 1 minute we were stretching the point to make it fit, and therefore in doing so I would lose my credibility, I wouldn't do it. I absolutely do believe it was written in 1896. We still do it today. All Haig was trying to do was apply it in between 14 and 18, and he uses it as a handrail to explain to people the rationale between why we have this bit in the middle where there's a lot of dying going on. But the pursuit phase, as you can see, 1918, lasts 4 months. Okay, right. Keep going and going and going and going and until you put them to the sword and they surrender. So right. Is that about right there, is it, Mike?
Yes. And for listeners, Phil was referencing my question that I was going to ask him, which was Field Marshal Haig's 1919 dispatch to the Army refers to the Field Service Regulation Principles. This was like a bit of a two-part question that I had for him. That was, how did Haig tie back to the FSR in his dispatch? And then my second question was like, had he applied a revisionist view by neatly fitting the entire war within the four main principles of war, which, you've already provided your...
If I was disingenuous, and I don't aim to I don't position ever Haig in a negative light. I don't need to do that. Mm-hmm. We have enough of that. Mm-hmm. You remember when you used to get your appraisals when you were serving, and it'd go, Mike's a really good soldier, but...
Yes.
And the but kills it. The but kills it. So the answer is we have enough of those, and I don't need to throw those in. Am I pro Haig? No, I'm pro Doctrine. My PhD is on the development of British military doctrine. Haig is just the best candidate I have, because from his very first essay in 1896 to all his papers and letters, they exist, and I can read it in his own handwriting. I can even read his words. I can even tell whether he's angry by his exclamation marks and an angry pen. You can. So you get a feel for the guy. Mm-hmm. So I would rather say, well, look, we've got a lot of Dennis Winter and that sort of stuff out there. We don't need any more. Right. Okay, if you want to read more of that, go and read some Tim Travers, go and read some Dennis Winter, go and read some De Groot. Go and do that, because you can do that. What we're saying is if we go back to saying, do you know what? There's another solution to this, which is this was the doctrine, and he used it every minute of every day. Yeah. And now go and have a look and go, why did he not? The only thing to mention is that you can trade off. And the big one, and it's something like, if you want to go back to Napoleon and Wellington, maybe, that this was man-o-man. They knew each other really well. It was, it's the same as Montgomery fighting Rommel. Montgomery knew that Rommel got to realise that Montgomery would always attack on a waxing moon. So the nights were getting longer. Mm-hmm. So he had to stop doing it. So he attacked on the night. So if you're opposite number, so Wellington knew that he could always get Napoleon to come out and bite. Yet Napoleon knew that Wellington would not come out until he was ready. So if you're playing man-o-man, then you need to do something that your opposition is not going to say. If you go to the Stonewall Jackson one, there's that brilliant account in there of doing something that was completely against all the principles of war, and it's about, what is it? Can't read. It's about the guys crossing something like 800 meters of open ground. If you're going to do something that your enemy is not going to expect, because he always does an artillery bombardment before he attacks, the answer is you've got to do something different. And the big trade-off always is surprise.
Yes.
Right. Do you know something? Concentration of mass at the decisive point. It doesn't matter how hard I fight Mike Tyson. I'm not going to beat him.
Right.
And I might if I stick my two fingers in his eyes, and he won't be expecting that.
Right.
So, see what I mean? You've got to
Exactly.
be able to play with it. You've got to be able to play with it. That if you go early, and people say, and there's a very famous quote, and I can't think of it from, which is, but a genius knows that if he goes early, he may lose his baggage and leave it behind, which means he knows it's going to be a quick victory and he's got to do it the next day because the soldiers won't get fed up. It's very Napoleon. I think it's Napoleon. But you need to know when you're going to do it. But if you know that you do the same thing over and over again, if you have a look at Kut at Mesopotamia, Townsend of Kut, as disastrous as that is, and he needs to be read within the context. He's a very good read, actually. Not to be, you can find his book, My War, Mesopotamia, on archive. It's worth reading. And he says that he realizes when he fights again at Ctesiphon, he has to do something different because he's already used a set of tactics, and the set of tactics are directly from the field service regulations, and he kind of knows that the Turks are going to do expecting what he's going to do, so he does something different. So you're allowed to play with it in the same way as Haig plays with the 4 phases of the war.
Right.
You can do something different. You can do
Right.
something different.
I'm
But what
thinking
you
of
do is you kind of trading off.
right. As far as unexpected, this popped into my head, and I apologize for referencing a TV series, but Band of Brothers, when the Americans
lovely.
are
Brilliant series. Brilliant series.
The attack on Foy, the village of Foy in Belgium, when Lieutenant Spears, they need to get a message to the other Americans on the other side of the village, but of course the Germans are in the village, so the man runs right through the Germans. And the way it's portrayed is like you have the Germans, they're actually like looking at him like, what is he doing? And then he comes back and does it again. It's so shocking and out of the ordinary that it's successful. So he's really thinking out of the box there.
And that's about application. It's about thinking. And this is and that's why when you're measuring principles, and there are people, and I won't name check them, if you see the principles as rules, and I could list 2 or 3 academics that still peddle this today, is that if you see it as a rule, then it's a rule that is broken, not a principle that's applied. Application of rules is so much more, application of principles is significantly more different than the application of a doctrine that you always go left flanking, you always go right flanking, you always twos up, bags of smoke, and we go straight down the middle because that's what we do every time.
Right.
By the way, if you look at and if you look at some of the things, I mean, and going back to Desert Storm, I know you guys will have the same images. The convoys that were coming out of Kuwait City that were taken out by the A-10s, Murder Mile. Okay, that didn't continue. The war was called to an end after 100 hours, and the Republican Guard, which was the T-72s, were taken up onto the Euphrates, and they were held back, and therefore we end up with another. We end up. This is the two wars fought by the 2 Bushes, isn't it? That Bush 2 has to come back and finish what Bush 1 didn't, because we didn't exploit and pursue to the end because of the images that were happening on the media. Okay, we called a halt, but of course the power base was still retained, and they came back a second time. So I mean, that's very simplistic, and I know people will have different views on that, but that is an example of what happens when you don't put the enemy to the sword, and it's very difficult to do, obviously in modern society, because. But ultimately, what will happen is, and it's very famous, is you can't have talks and negotiations while you're killing people. You've got to stop. Right. The chances are, whatever they've got, they will retain, and can be used for another day. So it's just as applicable today, I think, to be absolutely honest.
Awesome. Okay, your third article, Douglas Haig and the Principles of War. So in your third article, well, I mean, you've already been talking a bit, but I'll put the question out here in case there's anything else you'd like to add. How do you show that Haig applied Henderson's principles?
Right. I thought about this because I thought it's at the end, and I'll talk far too much, and we'll run out of time. So let's take Loos. Okay, Loos.
Sure.
25th, 26th of September 1915. Okay, a bit of a spoiler alert. That first of all, that we know that there's a problem with the reserves. Okay. Park that off to one side. Why does Haig need the GHQ reserve? Because he doesn't have one of his own. He has no army reserve. He has no corps reserve. He's only got divisional reserve. Why? Because he simply doesn't have enough soldiers of his own to do the job. So to get the concentration of mass, he uses everything he's got, okay? All on black to win, okay? That's what he's doing. And then he turns around to GHQ and says, but I do need your GHQ reserve. Now, up to this point, the GHQ reserve had never been released. Never. The pantomime of who's to blame, there's a very good book coming out through the Great War Group, which I'll let you read later. Nige Atter's article is, there's a brilliant smoking gun, you're going to love it. But the absolute reality is there's a reason. Nobody ever says why did he need the reserve. Because he hadn't got one of his own, because he needed a concentration of everything that he had. Then if you go to surprise, okay, his concentration, he has an issue, doesn't he? He doesn't have enough artillery. So he can't concentrate that. So what does he do? He uses gas. So it's a concentration of an effect. Okay, but to make it work, it's like one shot. Because the Germans, he's never used it. He is going to gain the maximum impact from the use of gas. Bearing in mind, he's mixing gas and smoke. The Germans won't know which is gas and which is smoke. They will eventually, so he has a mixture of gas and smoke. He knows that he's got one shot to use it. He's hoping the wind's in the right direction, and it only just is enough for it to blow in the right direction. He loses an element of surprise because the time for the attack of Loos was dictated by the French. He doesn't get to go pick his own time, so he loses the ability of his own choice. The only surprise he's got is he's going to use gas. He's going to use it for the first time, and he knows that the Germans have got a very rudimentary gas hood, not a proper respirator, and he is hoping that the impact on their morale will be such that he can exploit.
Right.
So you could find, fix, strike, but they all come together. So in that one example of Loos, you've got concentration of force, you've got concentration of effect, you've got surprise, and you've got the exploitation phase. You can do all of this all of the time. If you go to the beginning of the war, Haig, strategically thinking, he doesn't think the BF's big enough, and he also thinks that the BF needed to arrive with the French at the same time, and we're late. We are late, and we're 30% on demand. And 62% of our soldiers were civilians yesterday. Haig says, he just suggests that, look, maybe we ought to wait to mass the sum total of the whole of the empire so we can be a concentrated force. And if you have a look, actually in that final dispatch, which I know you've referenced, he says that at no point in the whole of the war do we ever harness the whole of the power of the empire. You imagine if it had been different, that you take the Americans, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Indians, ourselves, and the sum total of the maximum number of men, and you put them on the battlefield with all the ammunition that you need. But that never, ever happens because it grows and it's piecemeal and things are taken away and they end up in Palestine and Mesopotamia and wherever. But he actually talks about concentration of mass on the 4th and 5th of August before he even goes to war, saying, think we might have missed our opportunity. Do you think it might be best to wait? And he writes a letter to Kitchener, he writes a letter to Howlett, and he writes a letter to Haldane and Kitchener. He says, not quite sure. Maybe we've missed the boat. Maybe we ought to wait now. So he talks about that. And then at the very end, he says exactly the same. At no point on the concentration of mass at a decisive point did we ever find what you would call the Schwerpunkt. We never did it because we never massed it all in one place, and we just spread it so thin that we were lucky to achieve what we did. So Haig applies and thinks about it pretty well most of the time. And later on, there's a little bit of an operation going on before Loos. Canadians have arrived, not been there very long. Alderson, and he submits an operation order, and he sends it back, and he says, you've got too many troops concentrated in a too small a front. So that's economy of force. He then says there's a gap between the Indians and the Middle Brigade. You need to speak to them to coordinate your efforts, cooperation all the time. And then he gets one back and he sends it back and says, what happened to maneuver? What are you going to do when you get through?
Right.
So if you take one that everybody knows, is the Somme. If you know Moltke and no plan survives first contact, so who cares what happens 5 minutes after the song started. Was the plan a good plan? That's all he can plan. And then his subordinates deliver his plan. That's Rawlinson and Pulteney. That's who's delivering his plan. So if he is going to put Rawlinson, his most experienced army commander, 4th Army, and then he's going to take Pulteney, his most experienced corps commander, and then at Albert, and he's going to point them up the road to Bepin, and then behind Albert, he's going to situate a whole cavalry under Gough, who is known to be a bit of a thruster, and maybe he's realised at this stage that Rawlinson might not, he might not see it through. They'd say, well, at the end of the day, the whole point of putting the cavalry up that road was exploitation. And it was positioned at the beginning of the plan. You can't have, it's a bit like the reserves at Lewes. If your exploitation asset is not in the right place, then you can't use it. So, and Haig talks about this. He writes a paper in 1909, and he says leadership at the higher level leadership, it is the role of the commander to foresee. It is not the role of the commander to fight the battle. That is his subordinates and his chief of staff. So all Haig can go is, best case probability, picking my A team, okay, and my cavalry and sticking it there. And there's a road that goes from there to there based on his plan, his very first plan as a commander-in-chief in 1916 against what he'd learned at Neuve-Chapelle, at Westerburg, okay, and Lewes. That against what he knew, it was a very sound and good plan. You can argue, why didn't it? Then you look at the subordinates and say, did the subordinates deliver the plan as intended? That's the conversation that we should have. But that whole exploitation phase with the cavalry and Gough behind Albert, he was planning to exploit. So people view this and go, yeah, but that's because Haig was always optimistic. Okay, one old soldier to another old soldier. I don't want to go to war with a man who's not planning to win. We're planning to win.
Right, I'm coming out of this alive.
No, and I'm going to live, and it'll be you that dies. No, we know that. It's the other guy that dies. We know all of that. No, this is me and you. But of course, Rawlinson is a tactical thinker, so he bites and holds. Haig is the strategic thinker. He's thinking, if I am successful, what happens next? So it's a bit like, I don't know, do you guys play snooker or billiards? Yeah, so you have to put the white ball on the table and think where you need to be in 2 moves' time.
Right. Yep.
So Haig plays the white ball game. He doesn't just pop the balls, which is what Rawlinson's doing. Haig's thinking where the white ball needs to be for the next shot. There you go. I've never used a snooker analogy. I normally stick to my golf clubs.
That's a really good one, though. That's a really good one. No,
play the white ball game. Where do I need to be in 2 moves' time?
Yeah, and that is just as you said. That is his role as the commander, right? That's his job. Rawlinson is out there doing the finding and the fixing, and Haig is thinking exploitation afterwards.
And that's why Rawlinson comes back, and that's why Haig says, I think we can do far better than that. That's not what he wants him to do. And Haig gets around this, and you notice that Haig, after every meeting, he has conferences. There's one conference just before Lewes, 53 people, of which 38 are generals. He makes sure, we call it commander's intent. He makes sure that everybody knows. There's a very famous one. It's World War II. It's the British and the Americans in Italy, and they're down on the Amalfi Coast. And I think we've got the Americans going one side of the Apennines, and we're going the other side of the Apennines. And the American gets, I can't remember the gentleman's name, and he gets all of his officers, all the subunit commanders, right down to company and squadron level, and he goes, I'll see you on the Po. Every single human being knew this was the way we were going, and the River Po in the north was the objective. And it didn't matter then if no other orders were ever issued. Every commander knew what was inside the commander's head. Haig is very good at doing that. And if he gets this occasional kickback from Rawlinson, it covers it at the next conference, and it's in the minutes, and it's written by Butler or Kiggle or whoever, and it clearly says, no, this is what we are doing. This is the big picture. But of course, that's what you need to fight. You need to. That is the job. That is the job of the commander-in-chief. You don't want them thinking small. They need to think big, and that's why Foch is good, and that's why Joffre is good. They are big picture guys. They're not the tactical thinkers. And it's your ability to grow and develop. And of course, if you look and say, well, what happens if Haig had been replaced by somebody? Who did we have at that stage? And I don't know. I mean, people will throw a name in. You had to have somebody who had got what my boss used to say, brain the size of a planet. They've got to be able to juggle all this stuff,
right,
all of the time in their heads simultaneously. Writes the plans, he marks them, he sends them back, he goes on the rise in the afternoon, he visits his units. He every single evening when he's the commander-in-chief, he's hosting somebody for dinner, whether it's a politician from Britain or somebody from the French delegation, or when the Americans arrive, he's hosting them. And then he goes to bed and he still finds time to write home to his wife.
Yes.
His day's just mind-blowing. I mean, obviously he wears him down, but his absolute commitment and his capacity for work is mind-boggling. Absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, somebody's done a very good presentation on the Western Front Association. They picked one day in 1970, one day in Haig's life, and they've clearly picked a day which is a particularly busy day. But this isn't a guy sat in the chateau kicking back.
No, he was always frequently meeting diplomats and other generals and everything. Yes, I've read about that a lot. This has been fascinating.
I've loved it. I have. It's been great to speak to you, Mike, because normally I'm presenting, which means I'm script driven, and I'm like you. I can see you looking at your clock. But it is a question for your audience, and maybe we just leave it for them to come back, which is chateau generals. Why? Why were chateaus the place of choice for headquarters? Question mark. Answers on a $10 bill.
Oh, I like it.
There's a reason, because we never ask the question, why did Haig not have a reserve? There are reasons for this, and this is where we shoot the donkey people, which is there are reasons for all of this. There are reasons for all of this, and it's the same when we ask the same questions. I did one the other evening. If the cavalry are redundant in 1918, why did the British Army not mechanise till 1928, 10 years later? And they all look and go, I don't know. I said, well, you've just told us barbed wire, gas, trenches. That was the demise, and the cavalry was redundant before we even went to war. Okay, we were still converting 2 regiments to tanks. Okay, 1 in the first year of the Second World War. It took us 5 conversions, and the first 2 regiments we amalgamated were only to armoured cars. It wasn't even to tanks. Why? And if you answer the why, then you reverse engineer it and go, I see what you mean. So the cavalry was the only, and military terms is cavalry was the only means of exploitation that Haig had. Tanks aren't fast enough, aren't enough aeroplanes. What is his only thing that can move at 30 miles an hour at pace?
Cavalry.
Horses.
Yep.
But if you read it backwards, it makes no sense. If you read it forward, it makes sense. And of course, in the last 4 months, of course, and even in Palestine, when you've got the space and the movement it's not, and tanks are available in Palestine as well, and so is aviation, but they are not what's doing the routing, is it? It's the cavalry.
This is so interesting, Phil, because I remember reading about the Somme and Rawlinson's plan, and then reading that Haig had extended Rawlinson's plan further out, which to me was like, well, that's why this thing failed, because the objectives were too they were too ambitious. And but now, hearing this, like, it just makes me rethink everything. Like, maybe that is something that needs to be looked at again from this different light of like, well, Haig is applying these principles of war. Like, this is his job. He is supposed to think ambitious and big. Like,
you look at the bit you're talking about, which is the movement part, movement to mobility. You look at the bad guys, and you're probably going to attack in a place where you're looking at the roads and the communications and the railways behind, thinking, where's he going to bring his troops from? How's he going to reinforce himself? And hopefully you're going to pick a place in the middle of nowhere, because he can't get his troops there quick enough. Well, of course, that's why he employs Geddes and brings him in as civilian to build the roads and the railways, so that when behind the line he needs a massive infrastructure. We talk ad infinitum about this amazing railway network that the Germans built pre-1914 for their mobilisation to get the troops onto the border, and places like Aix-la-Chapelle, and the British and the Belgians and the French were looking at this developing network thinking, gosh. And if you look in Hugh Strawn's book, to arms. One of the only maps in there is a rail network, because all of a sudden you're now talking about trains and thinking, well, it's only small railways and big railways that now enables you to move troops en masse at speed,
Right.
to have them where you want. So Haig, by the time he's getting towards 17 and 18, is the Geddes' plan is starting to work. So he's not only it's kind of thinking for the future, because he knows he needs to be there, and he realizes that the military don't have the capacity for it, and he brings in Geddes as a civilian. And what does he do? And there's a whole bit that he gets some message back that there's a problem with some spares and stuff for the lorries.
Mm-hmm.
And he joins the dots up in his own head. He goes, but without the lorries, I can't build my railways.
Yes.
I need the railways, but without the lorries, can't build railways. And so the lorries aren't important. So no, I know the lorries aren't important because I can't move many troops with lorries, but they do move the supplies for building my railways, and it's the railways I need. So he is the ability to look beyond. And when people do then finally look at the incredible breakthroughs and the uses of the tanks in the various places, we still have to remind people that whether the tanks went through with or without artillery barrages, whether they went with or without infantry, all of those different scenarios that play out. But at the end of the day, who did the final exploitation? It was still horses. So, and this is not me trying to be cavalry centric. I say in every presentation, I will never ever seek to elevate the cavalry beyond the position that it was. But it would be kind of neat just to stick it where it should be, okay, which is not some obsolete, anarchic throwback from the medieval period. That is clearly not the case. But what's fascinating is, says he, military man to military man, is Haig, okay, grown up on a whole culture of decentralization, mission command.
Yes.
French, spent his whole life as a cavalryman. Allenby, all of his life as a cavalryman. So, again, another question, leave it to your audience. Smith Dorrien, infantryman, was waiting for further instructions prior to La Chateau. Question, was this because he came from an infantry background and was not used to having been required to use his initiative and plan for himself, as it said in accordance with the field service regulations, which man on the spot and no more information should be given to the man can decide for himself. Yeah. Is that just a reason maybe why Smith Dorrien has not grown up in a culture of decentralized and mission command? None of us would question that today. Haig didn't question it. Army doesn't question it. French doesn't question it. In fact, French issues the orders. He doesn't expect anybody to question it. Yet one man comes back and goes, we asked them for some orders, but I was just told they weren't issuing any. Now, field service regulations, you now throw that into La Chateau and go, right, okay, so did Smith Dorrien understand? You see the wormholes you can go down?
Yes.
But what you're using is, that is your unit of measurement, not had Haig led French any money and was French sleeping with somebody else's wife and all of that other stuff that you get,
right?
Which turns it into people who have personality and flaws, and then we look for the flaws in their personality and attribute that for the failings of the Somme or Passchendaele or the retreat from Mons or La Chateau, and we look at La Chateau and go, it's amazing because Smith Dorrien had survived Isla Nwana. Really? Do you know what I mean? We look for these little handles to hang stuff on, but we don't go back to go, like me and you. But what was he taught to do? I don't say was he a bookman, but what was his background? What did he read? What was his experience? What did he learn? Had he made mistakes in the past? Had he learned from them? And this is the whole thing with John Terrain's, the educated soldier, is the only thing that John Terrain doesn't do, which is the purpose of my PhD, is explain beyond his university education why he was educated. There's a brilliant presentation from Peter Hart on Haig. I've only watched a little bit of it, and he says one thing that Haig was he was a professional soldier. From the minute he gets to Sandhurst to England, this is his job. He reads everything that it is possible to read, and he internalizes it, and then he writes essay after essay after essay. In his own time, he has 2 books of essays on strategy and 2 essays on tactics that he's writing after Staff College. He's writing them in 1909. He's still exercising his mind and his thought right up to becoming the director of staff duties. It is absolutely constant. And you can see he quotes the field service regulations even when he's referring to them. He'll put FSR2, and he'll put the chapter, he'll put the section and the page and the serial number on the bottom of everything. It is, and when he corrects Rawlinson's work, he even corrects Rawlinson's work and tells him which page to go away and read. It's amazing stuff. A bit like my regimental miss. I think the true story is so much better.
Yes. No, absolutely. Yeah. Oh my God. Wow. What a fascinating talk, Phil. A couple of questions for you real quick. And so I just want to make sure that I have them right. The questions we want to put out to the listeners are, why were chateaus the places for the generals?
First choice. Yeah.
And were commanders not used to using initiative? Like in the case of
I mean, you can remember back in your day that it didn't matter whatever the policy was in your regiment, the different commanding officer, different OC command. Some would give you loads of space and loads of rope, and some would be a little bit tighter hold. So therefore, I knew how far I could put my neck out by knowing how far my boss had got my back. Mm-hmm. Some of the work we did out in the Balkans as a sergeant major, my boss gave me more space. It scared everybody to death. He said, "Well, we worked together before. He's bloke for the job. Are you sure? Yeah, he's just fine." But I've been with other people where you think, I'm not going to do anything here because I know if I get it wrong, they're going to chop you.
Right.
So, although it's policy, and it's the same in everything we do, that if you then go and say decentralized command then becomes a doctrine that's applied to such a degree it becomes a dogma, it has to have a flexibility within it. That, say, for instance, you're an OC and you've got 4 company commanders and you've got one who's really old in the tooth and he knows his stuff. And then you've got a couple of guys who've maybe done a tour, and then you've got a brand new guy. You can't be everywhere all of the time. You're going to issue your orders. Okay, you know the guy that's done this repeatedly, he's going to go out the door, and you're not even going to go and check on it because you know he's sorted.
Right.
You're going to the other two guys think, okay, I think they're okay, but the new guy that's just arrived, I'm going to go and spend some time with him. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and get his troop sergeant in as well. I'm going to have a bit of a chat about this. What you want them to do is all 4 of those guys have got to achieve the same output, but they may do it differently. And as a commander, you look at your staff and go, I may not, although I've got to delegate, I may not be able to delegate to the same level to all of you. And say, well, that's all right. You never go and check up on Bob. I said, no, Bob's been here 2 years. You only arrived yesterday.
Right.
I'm not interfering. It's called control, and I'm here to help you. So you then become their mentor. And Haig does a lot of mentoring. Okay, the guys he trusts, he just lets get on with it. When the new guys come, he pairs them together. He pairs units together. He puts them under ad hoc commands. He gets people to work together because he can't delegate and trust to everybody. And it's not until he gets until late 17 and 18 is he's got a whole command structure who he can trust everybody equally, and he can just step back and go, classic, make it so. And they're able to do so because they've now been in post long enough to have learned their own trade and skills and craft, and he doesn't have to sit there and constantly correct their homework. I'm just looking today, I've just got to February 1916. It's a lovely one because it's Henry Wilson, so we know it's not going to end well. And he's gone back to Rawlinson, and there's this gap where Rawlinson's ghosting for Monroe, where Monroe's coming back from Gallipoli. And clearly this memo looks like it's come straight from Wilson, not via the headquarters, gone straight into GHQ, because only Wilson would do that, wouldn't he? Completely bypass the chain of command because he thinks he's important. And the opening line just says, do you think your corps commander fully understands the situation? And then all at the bottom, he just corrects it, and sends it back. So, he's not doing that to people. He does it to everybody, but eventually he's not, there's less red ink. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because people now get to know, there's nothing worse than having your homework marked and sent back and say, show again. Right. And Rawlinson, the one that gets probably the most is Wilcox Indians. Until of course Wilcox himself stands down himself and says, do you not trust me anymore? The answer is sort of, but you keep putting in operation orders. In one of them says, if we follow this, it'll put the whole mission in jeopardy.
Right.
That's a big no. It's no, and he gives him 2, and he actually writes his objectives for him.
Wow.
So you shouldn't be doing that to an army commander, should you?
No, definitely not. Phil, the book you referenced with all of Haig's references to the FSR principles that you have right behind you.
Yeah. This is it's in 2 versions. This is Gary Sheffield and John Bourne's.
Okay.
Yeah, it comes in paperback and it comes in hardback. They've sold enough of books at the moment, so that you can get this for free on archive.org, although it's on a borrow. You can't download it, but you can word search it. So to flick through and look for those principles, it is relatively easy to do. There are, like anything, this reflects a man's lifetime, and it's even if you removed John's and Gary's words, it doesn't matter if you can take it or leave it. But of course, there are gaps. So if you take, for instance, between the 1st of January and the 1st of July, they themselves don't see that period of time as significance. But it is. The work by Robert Blake and the work by Dewar and the work by Borison, all of those, and even Duff Cooper, they're all on archive.org. The plus is that, and I can see what your readers might say, which is this is all from his handwritten works. So, and then of course he types up his work later, or his wife does, and there are some retrospective entries. The retrospective entries for me are not relevant. I put them in. Why isn't it relevant? Because they're only relevant if you think there's a conspiracy theory that at the end of the war, he rewrote his diaries for a purpose. Right, we've both been operations. You've been responsible for writing up your unit account of a day. You've also gone home to your ISO or your Coromek or your tent, and you've written to your wife in the evenings. Okay. The correspondence that you write, and also you may have kept a diary, you will have 3 different accounts of that day. Okay. Your letter to your wife will be benign, and you're not going to tell them what a shit day you've had any more than the fact is you nearly died. You're not going to tell your missus that. Okay. In the war diary, okay, you're going to put everything that you have to, but the fact is that maybe we got lost and threw a track. I might leave that bit out. Likewise, I might be like Haig and Smith-Dorrien and Royston, you might be writing diaries for the benefit of the king. So that's kind of a particular, but at the end, when you say, well, I think, your time out there, Mike, was fascinating. Do you think you ought to write it up into a book? You will pull all of those sources together.
Right.
All of them together. And if your wife is writing your memoir for you, which I would say she sort of was, but it's clearly, I believe, from the narratives of the various diaries, it was intended to be a memoir in the end. I get that feel because the prose changes, because you don't want an awful lot of detail. Okay, it skips across. It's an easy read. So if you believe that at the end of the war that Haig was completely rewriting everything to get his own view of history across, then of course that would support your conspiracy narrative. I don't come from there. I am perfectly happy to accept. Bear in mind that most people's diaries were written many years after the war. Haig is writing them at the time. That if you're going to then say, well, actually, this is retrospective because the amount of time has passed and now we call post-event rationalization, then you have to do that to every single memoir. You have to do that to Smith-Dorrien. He's the last to write. You have to apply that to the official history. He's still writing that in 1938. Do you know what I mean? That if you're saying that a passage of time precludes it from being legitimate, then what you're doing is for every single biography and diary, you have to apply the same magic. You cannot just apply it to Haig because it supports your conspiracy theory.
Right.
And I'm not from that. I mean, I don't think in particular, if he puts in brackets and he adds the name, he does. In the original diary, it says, the divisional commanders under Plumer were not fit to hold their commands. But actually later on, he just puts in brackets their names. So to me, I find that useful, and I don't see that as as being as detracting from the validity of the narrative. I don't. There's been plenty of work already written to show how close they are to each other. So hopefully the donkeys thing's gone away. So, but there are other works, and the advantage of reading people like the early works is they're quoting from letters and diaries. And it happens with French as well, by the way. With French, with his son, is some of the ink has faded so much you can't read it anymore. Mm-hmm. So when they wrote their diaries, when they wrote their works in 1928, etc., they could read it. So it's hugely useful to compare something that's sort of written and go, oh, right, I can see what that word is now because you can't read it.
Right.
But Borison could, Dewar could, Blake could, Duff Cooper could. They could read it then. So I think there is merit in using all of them together. I do. If you want the whole story, I do.
Oh, Phil, thank you so much for what a conversation. This has been fantastic, and my goodness, we have to have you back on. This is great.
The one we got floating around at the moment, which is, and it's not to be controversial, but it is to go back and look at La Chateau and Smith-Dorrien, and particularly around. Clausewitz talks about critical analysis, and he says 4 things: establish the facts, look for the causes, then attribute compliment or censure. Then you flip the page and he says, however, in suggesting how it could have been done better, set yourself above the general. Now, unless you've been a general, none of us are in that position. So our job is to establish the facts, look at the causes, and kind of leave it there, really. But what you find is that if you, it's like a jigsaw puzzle with half the bits missing, that if you get all the bits that are missing and then put it together, does the picture look the same? And then what you do is try and make a more complete picture and say, is that now how I understand the story has been told? And we can do that particularly with La Chateau. Again, leave it as a question mark and say, well, okay, people will come to the party, they'll already have an understanding of, well, they'll have already picked their sides, won't they? Everybody picks their side. They'll all want whoever's going to win it. Haig should have come and helped Smith-Dorrien. Smith-Dorrien was amazing, blah, blah, blah. Well, it doesn't matter what it is, but the answer is that built upon a lifetime study of facts, or are you just now quoting the words of somebody else from another book that you've learnt particularly well? And the soldier in a regimental history, it's the Bible. They learn it verbatim and never to be questioned. So as you put sacred cows to the slaughter, you have to show your homework. And if you look at my last presentation that's up on YouTube at the moment on Haig's command philosophy, is all my primary sources. They're all on the screen with all the footnotes, references. And that's gone down. It's gone down better than most. It looks like that Haig, although maybe he's a figure of controversy, actually, he's still a person of. It's not just controversy; he's a person of interest. He really is. I was surprised that. I was surprised anybody was bothered anymore. I thought, has Haig been done to death? And the answer would appear not. To be fair, would appear not.
Oh, that's excellent. Excellent. Well, all right. Well, we will we'll talk about Lake Chateau at some point. And God, thank you so much for coming on. And you mentioned earlier that you are near the very close to the point of submitting your PhD.
I have it complete now. Then it goes to Spencer. And then I'll probably do my viva at the end of the year. So as far as I'm concerned, unless Spencer tells me otherwise, and he's received each chapter as they've been written, so they've kind of been signed off. So it's now sort of, does it read from beginning to end? And it is the development of British military doctrine, 1870 to 1918, and its application by Douglas Haig.
Amazing.
The only thing that will be different is because you only get 100,000 words is that the application by Haig I've only done as a corps commander, as an army commander, and I stop at Luce. Okay. What I'm now doing is I'm now doing 16, 17 and 18, which will be on the word count, and then we'll add those to the PhD, and that will be the published work. And it'll probably go out through Hellion. They've already agreed to do that. It's just the length of the work, to be honest. There is so much that's not been used that at the end of the day, somebody famously once said it's like drinking. It's like drinking from a cup where you don't want to spill one drop. There is just so much. And I said to my wife, it's like when you write your thesis or your essay, you have to write it all, and then you only edit down when you've written it all. Yes. You can't write 5,000 words. You can't write 15,000 words. You're going to write 25,000 words, and you're going to edit down. So whatever I write, we will write, and then we will just have to throw 30% of it away. But you won't know what that 30% is until you've written it all. So It's looking a little daunting, but it'll be worth it, I think.
Oh, I think it's going to be a really interesting, fascinating read. Like,
can
wow,
I just make an apology as well? Because while we're going out there, is just to caveat. I'm so privileged to be invited onto your pod. Thank you so much. As I've said, I never set out to be controversial.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also aware that coming from a military background, sometimes I may inadvertently criticize academic historians. I don't mean to do that. I don't wish to create a divide. However, I do feel from a military background, maybe there is a dimension that we're able to add. I'll make a joke out of it. If you want to know what it's like to have children, don't ask me, ask my wife. Okay, she will give you the details. I've got a pretty good, strong understanding of what goes on. I was there at the beginning of the end, but there is a level of understanding that I think that when we looked at it, that we, as you can tell from our dialogue, there's a whole load of stuff that's common to our own thoughts. So, and if there's anybody I've checked out there, maybe if I've mentioned a historian who disagree with my assessment of them, again, I don't call out anybody deliberately. I don't have any axes to grind with any particular historians, either this side of the Atlantic or the far side. But I think that anything I might have said about anybody, I'd be more than happy to correspond with them and tell them why I feel the way I do. So don't really want a public stoning, if you know what I mean.
No, but the whole point here is for you to present your views, and then for folks to follow up and continue their own education, and and maybe engage in a debate with you off.
More than happy. Right. You've got my email address. If people do want to engage, please forward on my email address, and again, happy to share. Got lots of stuff. If people want particular references, if you can't be bothered to read all the way through the Field Service Regulations, you want to know what passages you can find the 8 principles, or you want to know what page references to find the fine, fix, and strike, just email me, and I'll send it over on a Word document. More than happy to share.
Oh, awesome.
I'll do the digging for you. I'll do the heavy digging.
All right.